I have a great pleasure in introducing Bill Ashton. Bill is the director of the Rural Development Institute at Brandon University. And the Rural Development Institute's research has included case studies of broadband in Churchill, Manitoba and Parsboro, Nova Scotia. Bill views broadband as a fundamental infrastructure in rural and other areas, like so much that we've seen today, much like roads and electricity. Besides an interest in broadband, Bill has examined numerous leadership roles and activities when developing local, regional, provincial, and federal policy. Please join me in welcoming Bill.
So today I'm hoping that to take you into a conversation that we're having in Manitoba. And if you remember about this time yesterday when we were talking about provincial policies, one of the policy provinces that wasn't mentioned was Manitoba. I'll try to fill in some of that discussion. So part of it is this discussion that we're having primarily within government agencies and some ISPs. And so I'm in some ways presenting some information. It's not going to be a research paper I'm presenting today, but it's going to be part of that conversation. What are the facets that we're considering at this point? And trying to give you a sense of the various sort of the variables and how do we start reaching out into the rural areas and rural and remote areas. So that's part of it. The other one is that I also want to just signal to you that there's a discussion around, or at least some identification around some of the projects that the Rural Development Institute is involved in. And also, we're still looking for papers for the Journal of Rural and Community Development. So if there's people want to talk about papers from this presentation or others relative to broadband, more than willing to have that conversation. A little bit about the Brandon University Rural Development Institute. We certainly have a mission. The mission's primarily centered on using applied research to identify problems in communities, challenges, opportunities, and then increasingly trying to figure out how to bring stakeholders together to take action. We have, if you will, a mandate. So 3 components of the mandate is applied research. So broadband, rural broadband, as you'll see the presentation today, is one of those topics. Rural immigration is another very large topic that we've been spending on. The second mandate is around knowledge dissemination, the cogeneration and the dissemination of knowledge. So we have a free online journal. We also have publications, and so we've got publications in a variety of areas that we've done in rural areas, not only just in Manitoba, but across Canada. We've also been instrumental in 3 of the rural policies out of OECD. So we've either reviewed them or have been on part of the teams developing them. So although we're located in rural Manitoba, we see our playground as both across Canada and OECD. With that, we also have a summer institute, a 2-week summer institute regarding comparative rural policy. Last year we were in Montreal, Quebec, and Rimouski. The year before that in Norway. In 2013 we're in Bologna, Italy. We bring 20 to 30 PhDs candidates together or graduate students and have 2 weeks looking at policy, primarily in the OECD countries. We're in a rural area, so we grow stuff, and one of the things I'm responsible for growing is rural researchers. And it might sound odd, but we have a degree, a master's degree in rural development. What I want to make sure is that the community folks, the government individuals, the private sector, as well as the students that we're working with, begin to understand there's an integral part of understanding rural, and you often don't get that from a city. And so beginning to understand that we're trying to fortify, we're trying to strengthen those people with a rural perspective so they can develop rural policy is quite important to us. So that's why we grow rural researchers. We're 20 years old, and we're actually 23 years old. We have 14 research affiliates across Canada. We have 5 full-time folks involved. We've got 4 project managers. These numbers keep changing. I think recently we have 4 grad students. One of ours just left for Tanzania, so we actually are 3 at this point. So that's constantly changing. Our funding model is pretty simple. The university pays my salary, and then we're left with trying to do projects, $300,000 to $1 million worth of projects every year. So we're reaching big capacity within the university, as well as other universities as well. So we partner with rural research centers across Canada and into the United States. Scott says I could do that, but I don't think he thought I could talk that much about it. Anyhow, let me talk about the presentation to get on with that. It's about disrupting policy because the policy so far advanced, so I'm talking about a context of Manitoba, and I'm not looking very broad, so it's reasonably narrow about Manitoba. I'm disrupting policy because in part we're trying to figure out what it is, and secondly, the rural isn't in the conversation about that I'm seeing so far in terms of broadband discussion in Manitoba. So we're trying to disrupt the silence in some ways to talk a little bit about a vision and a little bit about trying to figure out how to craft some action. And I said it's a conversation. So here's the people that have been around the table for about 3 years now. So there's Manitoba eHealth, Manitoba Innovation, Energy and Mines. I think that's their newest configuration as a department. We also have Health Canada, Aboriginal Affairs. We have the Manitoba Assembly of First Nations. The Chief Crate has joined us, and he is also the head of their Technology Council for all First Nations in Manitoba. This group has generally been meeting for about 3 years, and they are meeting quarterly. They have a senior departmental level in the provincial government they're reporting to, and they haven't reported to them for 24 months. And so the report has to be on rural and remote broadband. And the conversation so far is, and I happen to meet the acting chair out of eHealth, the co-author of this paper, and he's suggesting that he needed some help to understand rural. They had the urban side of it, the Winnipeg side of it, but outside of Winnipeg, there wasn't much understanding about how to move forward. So we ended up being asked to come into the conversation, and we listened for about 3 of the meetings. So we forced them to get caught up in all of their meetings in 1 month. So we had 3 meetings, and they simply talked about their various perspectives, and I started asking and formulating questions. And so this basically is what I heard from them relative to the conversation. So what's known? So we talked a little bit about what's known. What's currently missing? Why can't we have broadband in rural areas in rural Manitoba? What's being proposed? And what are some of the next steps that we're seeing? What's interesting for us is that the chair, as well as collectively around the table, they said, we're tired of sitting and talking, we want to take action. And I said, well, what do we mean by action? Because action can mean a lot of different things. What they wanted to do was connect one community after the other. Can we do that? And I'm going, okay, so now we understand what we mean by action. So we talked about what's known. So they put some of their technical folks together. We put a grad student together with them for the conversation. And we came up with, and we've heard this over and over in this conference already. We came up with these 5 bullets. One is around that coverage varies, predominated by cell phone coverage, but certainly when you get into rural and remote areas, it varies considerably. Secondly, we know that there are rural gaps. It's a dynamic situation because those gaps are being closed in by ExploreNet, NetSet, and others within the province. We also said that they were also hearing that the providers are narrowing this gap, if you will, in terms of the ISPs, and they wanted a little bit more around the economic impact. Is there any impact, economic uptake relative to bringing broadband to rural and remote communities? It was one of the areas that they didn't know anything about. And I also want to just have one slide relative to the 5 or 6 areas on return on investment that we're hearing from the telcos nationally. when we started putting this together, I suggested that rural isn't just rural. It's not a homogeneous concept. What we had to do was break up that notion a little bit. And I suggested that we're currently using 3 notions of rural in Winnipeg, or in Manitoba. There's multiple variations of this, but generally 3. There is rural around Winnipeg. It involves 15 communities around Winnipeg. Primarily, they commute to Winnipeg if you look at the labor market data. Okay, so that's an urban-centered rural. We have agricultural or farm rural or producer rural, primarily in the southern part of the province. These are the communities that you can see along the Trans-Canada and other places. They're small, they're based in the rural economy with producers, generally speaking. There is some rural manufacturing as well, but generally it's about that rural economy. And then the third rural is going north. And so that, for us, that means that you're moving north, you're getting fewer people, as well as there's things that are also changing. So the culture's changing. So there's more First Nations or Aboriginal folks culturally in those centers. Increasingly, as you move north, the centers have lower income, lower education levels. All of those are important in terms of just helping to differentiate or characterize, if you will, what's happening in terms of the north, or in terms of these rurals. So let me just talk about some of the coverages with that notion of rural in mind. So I'm going to talk about cell coverage in terms of the basic coverage. And if you can, as you're looking at this, again, I want to look at Manitoba. Certainly it's in the context of the prairies, but start beginning to see how dated, and in some cases how dated the cell phone coverage is, because this was in February when my grad student took this off. But again, some of the things that we're talking about where the coverage is and where the rurals are, and certainly where the people are. But you're beginning to see what's happened on a regional level with the variations of G3 and then G4. These are proposed areas, as I understand it, in terms of future coverage, but we do have coverage around the urban-centered rural areas, and then the big G4 in terms of future expansion around that. And so part of it is beginning to understand, and we've heard variations of this story today and yesterday around the cell phone is an integral part of it, but the coverage does vary in terms of the rural. I've suggested that, and we're hearing from the organizations as the various directors and assistant deputy ministers are pitching to their deputies and their ministers. They're talking about rural broadband in the same way as we talked about waterways, railways, and roadways, and electrification for the rural areas. It's an integral part of everybody's way of life. We haven't talked about it as Finland talked about in terms of a right. The estimates is that there's just over $3.2 billion have been invested since 2000 across Canada. And currently in terms of 2010, CRTC's records are suggesting that there's about 2.1 million households in these high-cost service areas across Canada. The response in terms of, as I read the CRTC, they certainly do have an aspirational goal, but I think they're saying, let the market forces continue to deliver service, and where appropriate, let the government give subsidies. But certainly, that's a long ways away from a national policy to give guidance to provincial policy. In February, in Dauphin, Manitoba, Bernard Lord, he's the president of the Telco Association, the National Telco Association. He's talking about the number of the millions of dollars to GDP in 2009 for wireless and services, exceeding that of agriculture, publishing, and mining. And that, for the Dauphin folks, was an astonishing number in terms of how much, because we were in the heart of agricultural area at the time. So give us a sense of the actual size of that activity. They also, in terms of this conversation, we also wanted to get a sense from CRTC's projections to the sort of 2017, where are we going? Is rural going to get served? In this graph, you can see that the urban is almost, if not completely saturated, is served. Rural, in terms of here, that we're seeing that it's improving over 2003 to 2011. It's likely that there will be probably a 10% continued unserved population in rural Canada in terms of broadband, or at least with this minimum service. I think there's variation on this trend because you can certainly, it's a question of affordability as well in this, in terms of potential satellite coverage as well. So we look at some of the part of the government folks who are interested in who are the ISPs. They know them better than I, but certainly in the Dauphin area, from the presentations, NetSet was there, and they certainly have multiple coverage around here's Winnipeg and somewhat into the north. Certainly ExploreNet. One of the important things for me is, besides the satellite coverage of ExploreNet, is their approach to rural communities. Much like what we've heard already, they try to get a local leader with a local technician. They try to have they have to have a prepaid anchor, and they hunt for subscribers. And there's something about that there's essence of that in the multiple conversations that we've had today and yesterday that are beginning to make sense to the people around the table that I'm talking with. Is that you just can't go in and deliver the technology and think that that's the end of the story. You've got to service it, you've got to upgrade it, and you've got to further penetrate into the market in terms of subscribers. We also looked at some independents, and so I brought in Andrews. He's the CEO of FR Now. He started out in '99 as an insurance broker. He's in Virden on the west side of Manitoba. He had offices at Carlisle and Moosomin, and he just simply wanted better internet service for his offices so they could transfer files back and forth. So he set up his own network with some stations, or with some towers. He then moved towards Now. He's got over 160 kilometers of fiber in and over 1,000 customers. He did not want to do this. He's an ISP that actually got into it by accident, and that's his claim around it. But he's servicing, the high school jumped on very early onto the game in terms of the anchor, and they moved forward. But what's interesting is that there's 10 or 12 or more of those independents that are finding the connections between what's the need in the community and how can they service that. And certainly BCN, the Broadband Communications North, ExploreNet has a very similar approach. They actually signed contracts with the communities, not unlike what we heard earlier with Tennessee in terms of a community technology assessment component to it. They bring in local leaders. They have to have local leaders moving through to a local technician, a local anchor, and subscribers in terms of their combination. We also have Manitoba Hydro in the conversation. Now, Manitoba Hydro, depending on who you speak to, they actually aren't in this business in broadband. So, but if you go on their website, they are in this business. They've got 28 communities. On top of the 28 communities, they mention nothing about the 14 Hutterite colonies. The Hutterite colonies have now mastered the art of some of the e-learning components to it, and so they coordinate because some of them, their classes are very small, and so they're lighting up some of the dark fiber with these guys to be able to do the connection. This is one of the case studies that I'm particularly interested in terms of e-learning. And in Manitoba's website, they do talk about the other sort of services that they deliver. But primarily now, and we heard this earlier about where's the fiber? Well, we don't know because they won't disclose it, but there is some connection around where it might be, but we still, again, part of the service and the actual lines, we don't know that. The group around the table were interested in getting an update relative to the Alberta SuperNet. There was some information available. Most of it was drawn off of the internet, so this may actually be old. I know there's SuperNet folks here, so I'm more than willing to have these slides updated as we go through in terms of this. So part of it was trying to understand the goal as one of the, I think it was one of the industry folks was talking a sense of the 98% households connected was the initial goal for the $300 million, connecting to rural centers in terms of government services, schools, hospitals, libraries, justices, and government buildings. We've heard that story a bit. And the last miles were left to the market. The challenge is the last mile. It's incredibly expensive. I know in 2011 there was a fairly substantial review. The website is dramatically changed for SuperNet, and the response, as I understand it currently, is really just an emphasis on access now, 100% access in rural areas. The group also wanted to get a sense of what's some of the economic studies saying. We were able to identify there's sort of economic studies relative to the global level, national level, urban-centered regions primarily, very little on rural areas and remote areas. We're seeing that there's evidence, growing evidence around the broadband, accelerating innovation for new services, improves productivity, and attracts employment. We also see that there's impacts are concentrated on government sectors as well as in manufacturing, and this gets bigger the more rural you get, if you will. The positive impact, as we've been able to see it, is that even after 4 years, there's positive impact of bringing broadband into community, but it has to be connected with some sort of training or learning process attached to that. There was mixed stories around the table as we were having the conversation around. Some people were arguing that businesses, that when you bring broadband in, it's a positive thing to businesses, and there might be a little bit of a downward slope afterwards, after it got settled in, which is sort of the first graph, and that is seems to be what the case is. There's also another story. It happened in our Churchill case, where in fact when you brought the broadband in, we were looking at 5 of the businesses, 2 of them lost employees. The impact here is that they simply understood that the cost of shipping, it was a mail order house out of Churchill, the cost of shipping and the timeliness of it was better out of Calgary than it was out of Churchill. So they actually, 2 of the businesses lost employees and moved into Calgary. Both parts of these stories, I think, are true in rural areas. To what extent they are in rural and remote, I'm still looking for information, but there's also some evidence that there is some positive growth in terms of jobs, in terms of the economic multipliers. We looked at cases, there's more cases already here, and again, these numbers from both Helen and others that we can get updated for it, so they were wanting to get some case studies involved, and we're just starting in that activity. And from Bernard Lord, in terms of his presentation, he was talking about moving, the conversation I was having is this notion of return on investment for broadband, and particularly in rural areas. He was talking generally, but I was talking particularly about rural areas. And we ended up with a conversation around these 6 items in terms of they're fairly general at this point, but beginning to understand how you would organize the pluses and minuses of broadband in terms of increased productivity, creates new jobs, generates new investment, enhances the social life, connects with families and friends. I think those could be very similar, as well as making communities safer. It's a beginning conversation around ROI, and if others are having additional conversation or evidence around this, and that's where I'm driving. I'm driving these sort of initial ideas around some evidence to be able to put some numbers to this. So at least there's a conversation that I understand is happening. To how extensive it is, I don't know. So in summary, rural broadband is improving. The digital gaps, there's likely to be a digital gap of about 10% of the total population. ISPs, big and small, are narrowing that gap. Broadband is driving innovation, jobs, revenues, multiple years of impact. There is possible multiple years of impact, and certainly economic impact. And the longer you're staying away from it, I think we need to start making some calculations of how much we'll miss as well. And then the return on investment in terms of the build out. Just as one last graph, the conversation that we had is with Industry Canada. They gave us, if you will, 40 underserved communities or unserved. And we ended up plotting them. They're not all in the south, nor many of them are in the north. 8 of them are First Nations communities. We're talking about 21,000 people, so this isn't 100,000, 200,000, 300,000, and very scattered. So now the challenge is, the go forward is with a vision of, can we identify 2 or 3 of those? Is there an ISP that might be able to do some infilling off of their network to be able to get access to some of the folks with broadband? We're setting the goal in terms of, first of all, we're looking at where the hospitals, government services, et cetera, and starting to create a bit of a hierarchy of where these nodes might be for services. We've got some other things dealing with social marketing approach over the first 3 to 5 years. So we build knowledge and skills and further adaptation and adoption of the technology. And that's currently where we are. We've set ourselves for the next 4 years to see how many of these 40 communities we can get connected to broadband in terms of that conversation. So it's not as big as the Eastern project in Ontario, but it could be. But it's certainly a much smaller population. Let me stop there. Thank you.
We have time for a couple of questions.
Just a question about.
Hold on a second.
Oh, sorry. Sorry about that. I'm just wondering if you could give us an update on some of the challenges that the Northern First Nations are currently facing in terms of their infrastructure, whether it's access networks or partnerships to get backbone or satellite infrastructure available?
All?
Whatever it is that you're currently seeing in your perspective.
Yeah, so what we're, I don't have the specifics in terms of answering the specific for each of the communities, but what our approach is trying to do at this point is, as I said, is trying to see if we can identify some of those government service centers and seeing if we can get broadband brought into those areas better than 15 megabytes. And it sounds modest, but certainly the discussion where I started was everybody knew that they weren't happy with 1.5, but they didn't know to what extent the higher level should be. And even at 15, it's not going to work. But moving forward, that's part of the discussion about how do we help work with the community leadership and start identifying the needs and their desires at that point.
Thanks for the presentation. One of the challenges I think we all face as researchers in looking at the return on investment for broadband would really be, what do you think some of the biggest barriers are to standardizing on the measurements of those benchmarks that are there?
Yeah. We've actually used and we've brought forward the report here with the indices that we heard yesterday. Part of the discussion for us is that when you have a market failure, how long do you think the subsidy will last? And I'm going, well, how long do you think there's been a market failure? So if there's been a market failure for 20 years, guess what? Broadband isn't going to solve the market failure. So the discussion around how much you're going to subsidize both the ISP as well as the others in terms of the users, there's a market failure. It's a rural area. So that's what this group is not hesitant around saying, we've got a problem here. The problem is the market's not functional. Okay, so building a business case is a bit odd, because the business case really is, if we can help the hospital run, instead of having people come from here over into Thompson and then flying down to Winnipeg, which depending on the train and depending on the connection, getting your son into the hospital in Winnipeg might be a 3-day journey, or at least a 2-day journey. And that's now they're paying for the hospital, they're paying for the mom and the dad, and there's a whole set of disruptions. So our business case is about what's the public cost, because it's a public good. So what's the whole cost associated with not having some of the broadband services? And that's where we aren't finding studies at this point to build a business case.
Final question, Bill?
So when you say bring broadband to these communities, you just showed our map that showed our satellite services covering 80% of those communities.
Right.
So is 5 meg services to those residents not satisfactory right now?
Well, certainly for e-health it's not.
So 5 meg for residential, though, is fine.
The committee's still trying to discuss that. Yeah, and partly it's affordability as well. And yeah.
Okay. And just as more informational on our satellite services, and I apologize, it seems very self-serving, but we do have capabilities of doing 25 meg on satellite services.
Perfect.
For enterprise. So it does cover some of the higher band services.
Okay. And so part of the information like that, admittedly, they're government folks. They're not spending lots of time about what are the services available. Your point around the satellite coverage. When I showed them the map, they didn't know there was that you guys put up a new satellite. So it's about there's the field. Just because it exists doesn't mean that everybody knows it, right? The future hasn't arrived to some people yet. So.